She bore 5 girls. She has no value, the cruel voices mocked during the harvest ceremony, their laughter cutting through the great hall like sharpened blades through silk. Princess Evelyn stood frozen at the edge of the stone dais, her hands trembling as the words struck deeper than any physical wound ever could. The lanterns flickered in the cold autumn wind that swept through the tall windows, casting dancing shadows across faces twisted with malicious amusement. The scent of sweet bread fresh from the ovens should have filled the air with warmth and comfort, but instead it seemed to mock her with its celebration of abundance, an abundance she had apparently failed to provide. The harvest ceremony had always been Evelyn's favorite time of year. Golden wheat sheaves adorned the walls, their earthy fragrance mingling with the rich aroma of spiced wine and roasted lamb. Children from the village would normally gather around her skirts, their eyes bright with wonder as she distributed small cloth dolls and honeyed cakes. But this year, everything felt different. This year, the whispers followed her everywhere she walked. 5 daughters, Duchess Cordelia had said earlier, her voice dripping with false sympathy as she adjusted her emerald green gown. Such a unique blessing from the gods. The pause before unique had been deliberate, calculated to wound, though I suppose some might question whether it's truly a blessing at all. Evelyn had bitten back her response then, just as she bit it back now. Her fingers instinctively moved to the small herb pouch hanging from her belt, a gift from her old nurse, Marta, who had whispered ancient protection spells over the dried lavender and sage within. The familiar texture of the worn leather grounded her, reminding her that she was more than what these people chose to see. The great hall stretched before her like a vast sea of judgment. Tapestries depicting the kingdom's glorious past hung from the stone walls, their golden threads catching the firelight. Heroes and kings stared down at her from their woven pedestals, all of the men who had led armies and conquered lands. Not one depicted a woman who had raised 5 strong, intelligent daughters with gentle hands and fierce love. Perhaps, came another voice from the crowd, if she had tried harder. Enough. The word cracked like a whip, though Evelyn hadn't been the one to speak it. The sound came from somewhere deep in the shadows, near the great oak doors, and every head turned to locate its source. The massive doors groaned open, admitting a rush of night air that made the flames dance wildly in their sconces. The temperature in the hall dropped several degrees, and Evelyn's breath misted slightly as she exhaled. Through the doorway stepped a figure that seemed to command the very darkness itself. He was tall, taller than any man in the hall, with shoulders broad enough to cast shadows across the stone floor. His cloak was the color of midnight, flowing behind him like liquid darkness as he moved with the fluid grace of a predator. But it was his face that made several guests step backward, their wine cups trembling in their hands. Sharp cheekbones caught the flickering light, and eyes the color of storm clouds surveyed the room with an intensity that made grown men look away. Darius Blackthorn, Alpha of the Nightfall clan, had arrived uninvited to the harvest ceremony. The hall fell into a silence so complete that Evelyn could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Even the children stopped their chatter, sensing something momentous in the air. The vampire Alpha never attended daytime court functions. His kind preferred the shadows, conducting their business during the twilight hours when the sun's power waned, but darkness had not yet claimed full dominion. Evelyn watched in fascination and growing confusion as Darius moved through the crowd with purposeful strides. Nobles stepped aside to make room for his passage, their colorful silk gowns and velvet doublets seeming suddenly garish against his austere elegance. He wore no crown, no symbols of rank save for the silver pendant that gleamed at his throat, a crescent moon overlaid with a star, the ancient symbol of the Nightfall clan. King Aldrich rose from his throne, his face a carefully neutral mask. "Lord Blackthorn, this is unexpected, Your Majesty." Darius inclined his head respectfully, but Evelyn noticed he didn't bow. The vampire clans acknowledged no mortal authority as superior to their own, though they had maintained an uneasy peace with the Daylight Kingdom for over a century. "To what do we owe the honor of your presence at our harvest celebration?" The king's voice carried a note of wariness. Vampires appearing during daylight hours, even the weakened autumn sun, was unusual enough to set everyone on edge. But Darius didn't answer the king immediately. Instead, he turned his stormy gaze toward the corner of the dais where Evelyn stood with her 5 daughters clustered around her like flowers seeking shelter from a sudden storm. The girls ranged in age from 4 to 14, each one beautiful in her own way, each one bearing the mark of their mother's gentle guidance in their clear eyes and confident bearing. "I heard voices raised in mockery," Darius said, his words carrying clearly through the hushed hall. "Words that dishonor not just a princess of this realm, but the very concept of worth itself." Heat flooded Evelyn's cheeks as every eye in the room turned to her once again. This was worse than the initial humiliation. Now she was the subject of attention from the most dangerous man in 3 kingdoms, and she had no idea why. "Lord Blackthorn," Duchess Cordelia spoke up, her voice artificially sweet. "Surely you don't concern yourself with the domestic matters of the Daylight Court." The Alpha's gaze shifted to the Duchess, and something in his expression made her take a small step backward. "I concern myself with justice, Your Grace, and with recognizing true value when I see it." He looked back at Evelyn, and she felt something strange flutter in her chest. Not fear, exactly, but a recognition of power that was entirely different from the political machinations she was accustomed to. "Tell me," Darius continued, his voice growing softer but somehow more commanding, "what is the worth of 5 daughters raised with love and wisdom? What is the value of 5 young women who will grow to be leaders, healers, teachers, and guardians in their own right?" Evelyn's oldest daughter, Helena, stepped forward slightly, her chin raised with the same stubborn pride that had gotten Evelyn into trouble more than once. At 14, Helena already showed signs of the quick wit and fierce loyalty that had made her mother beloved by the common folk, even if the nobles found her too independent for their tastes. "They are precious beyond measure," Helena said clearly, her young voice carrying surprising strength. "Each one of my sisters brings something unique to our family and our kingdom." A murmur ran through the crowd, some approving, others scandalized that a child would speak so boldly in the presence of the Alpha. But Darius smiled, the expression transforming his stern features into something unexpectedly warm. "Indeed they are." He moved closer to the dais, close enough that Evelyn could see the fine silver embroidery on his dark clothing, close enough to catch the scent of night air and something else, pine forests and distant rain. "Which is why I come before this court today with a formal declaration." The king leaned forward on his throne, his knuckles white where they gripped the armrests. "What manner of declaration?" Darius swept his cloak back and knelt, not to the king but to Evelyn and her daughters. The gesture was so unexpected, so unprecedented, that several people gasped aloud. The vampire clans bowed to no one. They were creatures of pride and ancient power, beings who remembered when humans huddled around fires and feared the darkness. "I take her as mine," Darius announced, his voice ringing through the suddenly electric silence. "Princess Evelyn of the Morning Realm, I claim you as my chosen consort and your daughters as my protected wards." The hall erupted into chaos. Voices rose in shock, confusion, and in some cases, outrage. Evelyn heard fragments of conversation spinning around her like autumn leaves caught in a whirlwind. "Impossible. A vampire cannot simply... What does this mean for the treaty? 5 girls worthless, and now..." But through it all, Evelyn found herself staring into Darius's storm-grey eyes, searching for some hint of his true motivation. This made no sense. She had met him perhaps 3 times in her life, always during formal diplomatic functions, always with dozens of other people present. They had never exchanged more than polite pleasantries about trade agreements and border security. Why? The word escaped her lips before she could stop it, barely audible above the din of shocked conversations around them. Darius rose to his feet with that same fluid grace, never breaking eye contact with her. Because worth is not measured by the gender of one's children, princess. It is measured by the strength of one's heart, the depth of one's compassion, and the courage to stand against those who would diminish others for their own petty satisfaction. King Aldrich finally found his voice. Lord Blackthorn, this is highly irregular. There are protocols, negotiations that must take place. Of course, Your Majesty. Darius inclined his head again. I propose we begin those negotiations immediately. Perhaps over a feast where both our courts might come to know each other better. He gestured toward the laden tables that had been prepared for the harvest celebration. It seems you already have the perfect setting. The political implications hit Evelyn like a physical blow. By claiming her publicly, Darius had made it impossible for the court to simply dismiss her worth any longer. Whatever his true motivations, he had effectively shielded her from further humiliation and given her daughters a protection that even royal blood couldn't guarantee. But at what cost? And why would the most powerful vampire in 3 kingdoms risk his own political standing for a woman he barely knew? As if sensing her thoughts, Darius stepped closer, close enough that only she could hear his next words. "Trust me," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear, despite the chill that seemed to emanate from his very presence. "I know this is sudden, but I would not have you suffer their mockery for even one more moment." Before she could respond, he had stepped back and was addressing the hall once more, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from centuries of commanding obedience. "Let the feast begin," he announced. "Tonight, we celebrate not just the harvest, but the beginning of a new understanding between our peoples." The crowd began to move, some rushing toward the tables laden with food, others clustering in small groups to whisper frantically about this unexpected turn of events. But Evelyn remained frozen in place, her daughters pressed close around her, all of them staring up at the mysterious vampire who had just changed the course of their lives with a few simple words. "Mama," whispered her youngest Iris, tugging on the edge of Evelyn's deep blue gown, "is the dark man going to be our new papa?" Out of the mouths of babes. Evelyn looked down at her daughter's innocent face, then back up at Darius, who was now engaged in what appeared to be an intense discussion with several of the king's advisors. Whatever game he was playing, whatever political maneuvering had prompted this dramatic gesture, there was no turning back now. The Alpha had claimed her as his own in front of the entire court. According to the ancient laws that governed both their peoples, that claim was as binding as any marriage ceremony. She was no longer just a princess who had disappointed expectations by failing to produce male heirs. She was now the chosen consort of the most dangerous man in 3 kingdoms, and she had no idea what that was going to mean for her or her daughters. But as she watched Darius command the respect and attention of nobles who had been mocking her mere minutes before, Evelyn felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. Perhaps there was more to this than political convenience. Perhaps for the first time in her life, someone truly saw her worth. The harvest ceremony continued around them, but everything had changed. The night air that had swept in with Darius's arrival seemed to carry with it the promise of transformation, of challenges and possibilities that Evelyn couldn't yet imagine. Whatever came next, there was no going back to the way things had been. The mockery that had cut so deep was now impossible to ignore or dismiss, and the protection of the Nightfall clan was not something to be taken lightly. As the evening progressed and the initial shock began to wear off, Evelyn found herself studying her unexpected protector with growing curiosity. Who was Darius Blackthorn really? What had prompted him to take such a dramatic risk? And what would he expect from her in return for his protection? The questions multiplied with each passing moment, but one thing was becoming increasingly clear. Her quiet life as a dismissed princess was over. Whatever lay ahead would be far more complicated, far more dangerous, and potentially far more rewarding than anything she had ever imagined. The Alpha had claimed her, and in doing so, he had set in motion events that would change not just her fate, but the delicate balance of power between the daylight and nightfall realms. The only question now was whether she would prove worthy of the faith he had shown in her, or whether his dramatic gesture would ultimately prove to be a mistake that could cost them all everything they held dear. 3 weeks had passed since the harvest ceremony, and Evelyn still felt like she was living someone else's life. The formal betrothal negotiations had proceeded with surprising smoothness, though she suspected that had more to do with fear of Darius's reaction than genuine acceptance from the court. Tonight would mark the first official feast between the daylight and nightfall courts, a diplomatic dinner that would either forge a new alliance or expose the fragile nature of their hastily arranged union. She stood before her mirror, adjusting the deep burgundy gown that Marta had selected for the evening. The color was meant to bridge the gap between day and night, rich enough to show respect for vampire sensibilities while maintaining the warmth associated with mortal celebrations. The herb pouch still hung at her waist, though now it felt less like protection and more like a talisman of the woman she used to be. "You look beautiful, Mama," Helena said from her perch on the window seat, where she had been watching the sun set over the castle grounds. At 14, her eldest daughter possessed an intuition that sometimes startled Evelyn with its accuracy. "But you also look terrified." "I'm not terrified," Evelyn lied, then caught herself. She had always been honest with her daughters. There was no reason to start dissembling now. Perhaps a little nervous. "This dinner is important for our kingdom's future." "And for yours?" This came from 12-year-old Sophia, who had inherited her mother's gift for seeing straight to the heart of complicated matters. She sat cross-legged on the floor, braiding Iris's golden hair, while the 4-year-old played with her cloth dolls. Before Evelyn could answer, a soft knock interrupted their conversation. "Enter," she called, expecting to see Marta with some last-minute adjustment to her appearance. Instead, Darius himself stepped through the doorway, and Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She had seen him in formal court attire before, but never in the intimate setting of her private chambers. He wore midnight blue velvet that seemed to absorb the lamplight, with silver threads worked into intricate patterns across the chest and sleeves. His dark hair was pulled back in a style that emphasized the sharp angles of his face, and those storm-gray eyes seemed to take in every detail of the room in a single glance. "Lord Blackthorn," Evelyn managed, dropping into a curtsy that felt awkward in the casual atmosphere of her family's evening routine. "Darius," he corrected gently. "If we are to be married, perhaps we might dispense with such formality in private." His gaze moved to her daughters, and his stern expression softened considerably. "Good evening, ladies. I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I brought something I thought you might enjoy." From beneath his cloak, he produced a leather-bound book with pages edged in gold. Helena's eyes widened with interest. She had inherited her mother's love of reading and had devoured every text in the castle's library at least twice. "It's a collection of songs," Darius explained, offering the book to Helena. "Lullabies and ballads from the Nightfall realm. Some of them are quite old, older than your kingdom, in fact. I thought perhaps you might find them interesting." Helena accepted the book with reverent hands, immediately opening it to examine the flowing script within. "These are beautiful," she breathed. "Look at the musical notations. I've never seen anything like them." "The symbols are designed to capture not just melody, but mood and atmosphere," Darius said, moving closer to point out specific markings on the page. "This one here indicates that the song should be sung only during the darkest hour of night, when the moon is hidden behind clouds." Evelyn watched in fascination as her typically reserved daughter engaged in animated conversation with the vampire lord. It was perhaps the first normal interaction she had witnessed between Darius and anyone from her world, and it revealed a side of him she hadn't expected: patience, genuine interest in Helena's questions, and an almost scholarly enthusiasm for the subject matter. "Mama used to sing to us every night when we were little," Sophia volunteered, looking up from her braiding. "She has the most beautiful voice in the whole kingdom." "Does she indeed?" Darius's eyes found Evelyn's across the room, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Perhaps I might be fortunate enough to hear it sometime." "She still sings to me," Iris piped up from the floor, her dolls temporarily forgotten. "When the storms are loud and scary, Mama's songs make them go away." Something shifted in Darius's expression, a flicker of vulnerability that was gone so quickly, Evelyn almost thought she had imagined it. But she had spent years learning to read the subtle emotions of children. She recognized the look of someone who had been without comfort for far too long. "That sounds like very powerful magic," he said seriously to Iris, crouching down to her level. "The ability to chase away storms with nothing but song is a rare gift indeed." Iris giggled, delighted by his attention. "It's not really magic, it's just love." "Ah," Darius nodded solemnly. "Then it is the strongest magic of all." A knock at the door interrupted the moment, and Marta entered with her usual bustle of efficiency. "Begging your pardon, Your Highness, but the guests will be arriving soon." "It's time." She stopped short when she noticed Darius, her weathered face cycling through surprise, suspicion, and finally grudging respect as she took in the scene of him conversing easily with the children. "Of course," Evelyn said, smoothing her skirts nervously. "Girls, please go with Marta to the small dining hall. You'll be having supper there tonight, while the adults attend the formal dinner." A chorus of protests arose from her daughters, but it was Darius who surprised everyone by speaking up. "Actually," he said, straightening to his full height, "I was hoping the young ladies might join us for at least the first course. In my realm, children are considered part of the family unit, not separate from it. I believe their presence would help both courts see this alliance as more than just political maneuvering." Evelyn stared at him in shock. The formal protocol for diplomatic dinners was sacred, unchanged for centuries. Children were never included in such serious affairs. But as she considered his words, she realized the genius of his suggestion. By including her daughters, he was making it clear that this union was about family, about the future, about something more substantial than temporary political convenience. "That's highly unusual," she said carefully. "Many things about our situation are unusual," Darius replied with a slight smile. "Why not embrace that fact rather than fight against it?" 20 minutes later, Evelyn found herself walking into the great hall, with her daughters arrayed around her like living proof of her worth. The long table had been set with the finest silver and crystal, and the scents of roasted lamb, fresh bread, and spiced wine filled the air. But it was the guests themselves that commanded her attention. On one side of the table sat the familiar faces of the Daylight Court: King Aldrich, Duchess Cordelia, various nobles and advisors, all dressed in their finest silks and velvets. But on the other side sat beings she had never seen in such formal circumstances, members of the Nightfall clan in all their ethereal beauty and subtle menace. Darius's second in command was a woman named Lyra, whose silver hair seemed to glow in the candlelight and whose violet eyes held centuries of accumulated wisdom. Beside her sat Marcus, a younger vampire whose boyish face belied the fact that he was older than Evelyn's grandfather. And at the head of the table, in the place of honor that he had refused during the harvest ceremony, Darius himself waited to begin the meal. But as they took their seats, Evelyn noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. Instead of claiming the chair beside hers, Darius had arranged for the seating to place her daughters between the vampire guests and herself. Helena sat beside Lyra, chattering excitedly about the Book of Songs. Sophia had somehow struck up a conversation with Marcus about the intricacies of nighttime navigation by starlight. Even little Iris was engaged in what appeared to be a serious discussion with an elderly vampire about the relative merits of different types of dolls. It was a deliberate choice, Evelyn realized. By placing himself among her children rather than possessively beside her, Darius was demonstrating to both courts that his interest lay in protecting and valuing her family, not in acquiring a trophy wife. The first course arrived. A delicate soup flavored with herbs that Evelyn didn't recognize, but that filled the air with an almost otherworldly fragrance. As they ate, conversation flowed more easily than she had dared to hope. The vampires were charming dinner companions, asking thoughtful questions about daily life in the mortal realm, and sharing carefully edited stories of their own experiences. It was during the second course that Duchess Cordelia made her first attempt to reassert the social order that Darius's claim had disrupted. "Lord Blackthorne," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone of false sweetness that Evelyn had learned to dread, "I must say your generosity toward the princess is quite remarkable. Taking on a woman with 5 children is such a tremendous responsibility. Not every man would be so charitable." The word charitable hung in the air like a poisonous cloud, and Evelyn felt her cheeks burn with humiliation. But before she could formulate a response, Helena's clear young voice cut through the tension. "Lord Darius isn't being charitable," her daughter said firmly, looking directly at the Duchess with the fearless honesty of youth. "He's being smart. Our mother is the strongest, kindest, most intelligent woman in the kingdom. Any man would be lucky to have her choose him." A ripple of surprised murmurs ran around the table, but it was Lyra who spoke next, her musical voice carrying easily through the great hall. "The child speaks truth," the vampire woman said, raising her wineglass in a small salute to Helena. "In our realm, we have observed Princess Evelyn for many years. Her reputation for wisdom and compassion has reached even into the shadows. When she organized relief efforts during the poor harvest 3 summers ago, she fed as many of our people as yours, despite having no obligation to do so." Evelyn blinked in surprise. She remembered the summer Lyra referenced when early frosts had devastated the grain crops and left many families facing starvation. She had indeed opened the royal granaries to anyone in need, regardless of their allegiance to day or night. But she hadn't realized that the vampire community had taken notice. "Or," Marcus added with a grin that revealed just a hint of fang, "when she personally tended to the wounded after the border skirmish with the mountain clans. I seem to recall she spent 3 days in the healing tents, working alongside the physicians to save lives." "Even ours," Lyra added quietly. "When 2 of our scouts were found injured in the aftermath, it was Princess Evelyn who insisted they receive the same care as any wounded soldier." Darius had been listening to this recitation with growing intensity, his storm-grey eyes fixed on Evelyn's face as if seeing her clearly for the first time. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of conviction that silenced every other conversation at the table. "You see," he said, addressing the Duchess but keeping his gaze on Evelyn, "this is precisely why I chose her, not out of charity, but out of recognition. Princess Evelyn embodies the kind of leadership our peoples need, leadership based on wisdom rather than tradition, on compassion rather than conquest, on the courage to do what is right rather than what is easy." The Duchess opened her mouth to respond, but King Aldrich cleared his throat meaningfully, and she subsided into sullen silence. The conversation gradually returned to safer topics: trade agreements, seasonal festivals, the upcoming winter preparations. But as the evening progressed, Evelyn became aware of a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The vampires were no longer simply tolerating her children's presence, they were actively engaging with them, answering questions with patience and genuine interest. And more surprisingly, several of the daylight nobles were beginning to follow suit, drawn into conversations about music, astronomy, and philosophy that her daughters navigated with impressive sophistication. It was during the final course that the most significant moment of the evening occurred. As servants cleared away the remnants of honeyed cakes and candied fruits, little Iris slipped down from her chair and approached Darius with the fearless confidence of a child who had never been taught to fear the darkness. "Lord Darius," she said in her piping voice, tugging gently on his sleeve, "you look sad. Would you like to hear one of Mama's songs? They make everything better." A hush fell over the table as every guest turned to watch this unprecedented interaction. Evelyn felt her heart hammering against her ribs, torn between pride in her daughter's compassionate instincts and terror at what the vampires might think of such presumption. But Darius simply smiled, the first genuinely warm smile Evelyn had seen from him, and lifted Iris onto his lap with surprising gentleness. "I would like that very much," he said seriously. "But perhaps your mama would need some encouragement?" All eyes turned to Evelyn, and she felt the familiar flutter of stage fright that always preceded public performances. But looking around the table, at her daughter's expectant faces, at the vampire's curious expressions, at the mixture of anticipation and skepticism from her own court, she realized that this moment was about more than just entertainment. This was a test, not of her voice or her memory for lyrics, but of her willingness to be vulnerable, to share something precious and personal with people who might not appreciate or understand its value. She reached for the small leather journal she always carried, the one containing the lullabies and ballads she had collected over the years, songs learned from nurses and traveling minstrels, and half-remembered fragments of her own mother's voice. Her fingers found the page almost without conscious thought, settling on a melody that had comforted her daughters through countless sleepless nights and fevered dreams. When she began to sing, her voice was soft at first, almost tentative. But as the familiar words flowed over her tongue, she felt the tension leave her shoulders and the anxiety fade from her mind. This was her gift, her magic, the ability to weave comfort and peace into simple melodies, to chase away fear with nothing but love made audible. The song was an old one, about a garden where flowers bloomed even in winter and stars came down to dance among the roses. As she sang, Evelyn noticed something extraordinary happening around the table. The vampires were leaning forward, their usually controlled expressions showing something approaching wonder. Even Duchess Cordelia had stopped her habitual fidgeting and was listening with rapt attention, but it was Darius's reaction that captured her focus entirely. The harsh lines of his face had softened, and his eyes had taken on a distant quality, as if her voice was carrying him to some far-off place where pain couldn't follow. When she reached the final verse, the part about finding peace in unexpected places, she saw him close his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, they seemed to hold a depth of gratitude that took her breath away. As the last notes faded into silence, no one moved or spoke for several heartbeats. Then, slowly, Marcus began to applaud, followed by Lyra, then the other vampires, and finally the entire table erupted in appreciation that felt genuine rather than merely polite. "Beautiful," Darius murmured, his voice rough with emotion as Iris settled more comfortably against his chest. "Thank you for sharing that with us." But even as Evelyn basked in the warmth of the moment, she couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just occurred, something that went beyond mere entertainment or diplomatic courtesy. The way Darius had reacted to her song, the vulnerability she had glimpsed in his eyes, suggested that there were depths to this arrangement she was only beginning to understand. As the evening wound to a close and guests began to take their leave, Evelyn found herself walking toward her chambers with questions multiplying in her mind. What had prompted Darius to claim her so dramatically? What did he hope to gain from this alliance? And why did she find herself hoping that his motivations might be more personal than political? The answers, she suspected, would only come with time. But as she tucked her daughters into their beds and listened to their excited chatter about the vampire guests, Evelyn allowed herself to feel something she hadn't experienced in years: anticipation for what tomorrow might bring. The alliance between day and night had begun, but the real journey, the one that would determine whether this arrangement became a true partnership or remained merely a political convenience, was only just starting. Whatever challenges lay ahead, tonight had proven that bridges could be built between their worlds. The question now was whether those bridges would prove strong enough to withstand the storms that were surely coming. Winter had settled over the kingdom like a heavy blanket, transforming the castle grounds into a crystalline wonderland that sparkled under the pale sun. 6 months had passed since the harvest ceremony, and Evelyn's life had become a delicate dance between two worlds: the familiar rhythms of daylight court and the mysterious customs of her vampire betrothed. She stood now in the ancient library, surrounded by towers of leather-bound books and scrolls that seemed to hold the weight of centuries. The discovery had been accidental. While searching for historical records about trade agreements, she had stumbled upon a hidden compartment in an old oak chest. Inside lay a diary bound in midnight blue leather, its pages yellowed with age, but the ink still clearly legible. Her ancestral grandmother's journal. The very woman whose portrait hung in the Gallery of Queens, whose reign was remembered as a time of unprecedented peace and prosperity. "Evelyn?" Darius's voice drew her from her absorbed reading. She looked up to find him standing in the doorway, snowflakes still clinging to his dark hair from his ride back from the Nightfall territories. "Marta said I might find you here. You missed the afternoon meal." "I found something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Darius, I think I understand now why you really chose me." He moved closer, his expression growing concerned as he took in her pale complexion and the ancient diary clutched in her trembling hands. "What have you discovered?" "The Covenant," she breathed, turning the diary toward him so he could see the faded script. "My great-great-grandmother, Queen Isadora, she made a pact with the Nightfall clan. Protection for the kingdom's children in exchange for sanctuary during the dawn hours." Darius went very still, his storm-gray eyes fixed on the open pages. "You weren't supposed to find that. Not yet. But I did." Evelyn's voice grew stronger, fueled by a mixture of anger and understanding. "The red thread embroidered in all our linens, the specific herbs Marta always insisted on growing, the way the bells in the tower ring at precise intervals. It's all part of the Covenant, isn't it? Living clauses that maintain the agreement between our peoples." She stood, pacing to the tall windows that looked out over the snow-covered courtyard where her daughters were building elaborate snow sculptures with some of the younger vampire attendants. The sight should have alarmed her, mortal children playing with creatures of the night, but instead it filled her with a strange sense of rightness. "Helena has been teaching Lyra's nephew how to read music," she continued, not looking at him. "Sophia spent yesterday showing Marcus the best places to find winter herbs. Even little Iris seems to instinctively understand that our guests need different care than mortals do. She's been leaving small drawings under their doors during the daylight hours." "They are remarkable children," Darius said quietly. "But then they have a remarkable mother." Evelyn turned back to face him, and for the first time since his dramatic claim at the harvest ceremony, she allowed herself to really look at him. Not as the dangerous alpha of the Nightfall clan, not as a political ally or a mysterious protector, but as a man who had carried the weight of ancient promises for longer than she could imagine. "How long have you known?" she asked. "About the Covenant? About what I am supposed to be?" "Since the night you were born," he admitted, moving to stand beside her at the window. "Your father sent word to our clan, as was proper according to the old agreements. A daughter born of the royal line, marked by the moon. We have been waiting for you to take your place as guardian of the dawn for 27 years. The words hit her like a physical blow. "Marked by the moon? What are you talking about?" Instead of answering immediately, Darius reached for her left wrist, gently pushing back the sleeve of her winter gown to reveal the pale skin beneath. There, just above her pulse point, was a mark she had carried all her life. A crescent-shaped birthmark so faint it was barely visible unless the light hit it just right. "The same mark your daughters carry," he said softly. "Have you never noticed? The way Helena's appears when she's concentrating on her music. How Sophia's glows slightly when she's working with healing herbs. The way Iris's seems to shimmer when she laughs." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as memories flooded back. Moments when she had glimpsed something unusual about her daughters, but had dismissed it as tricks of candlelight or her own imagination. Now, with the truth laid bare before her, she could see it clearly. The subtle luminescence that seemed to emanate from each of her girls when they were engaged in activities that brought them joy or purpose. "We are the descendants who can calm the darkness," she whispered, the words from the diary echoing in her mind. "The bloodline that can ease the hunger, soothe the rage, bring peace to those who have forgotten what peace feels like." Yes, Darius's voice was rough with emotion. "But more than that, you are the guardian who can extend the dawn, who can give my people precious extra minutes of safe passage between night and day. The ritual requires willing participation from both realms, bread and salt shared in trust, and a guardian who understands that power is meant to serve, not to dominate." Before Evelyn could respond, urgent voices in the courtyard below drew their attention. Through the window they could see a commotion near the main gates, riders approaching through the swirling snow, their horses lathered with sweat and foam despite the bitter cold. "News from the capital," Darius muttered, his expression darkening. "And given the speed of their approach, it's not good news." They hurried down to the Great Hall, arriving just as the messengers were ushered in by the guards. The lead rider was Sir Edmund, one of King Aldric's most trusted knights, his usually pristine uniform now mud-splattered and wrinkled from hard travel. "Your Highness," he gasped, dropping into a bow before Evelyn. "Lord Blackthorn, I bring urgent word from the capital. Duchess Cordelia has filed a formal petition with the High Council, challenging your betrothal on the grounds that—" He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the message he carried. "Speak plainly, Sir Edmund," Evelyn said, her voice steady despite the cold dread settling in her stomach. "On the grounds that bearing only daughters disqualifies you from entering into binding agreements with foreign powers. She claims that without male heirs, you cannot guarantee the continuation of any treaties or alliances formed through marriage." Silence fell over the hall like a physical weight. Evelyn felt the familiar sting of humiliation, but this time it was accompanied by something else, a burning anger that started in her chest and spread outward like wildfire. "Furthermore," Sir Edmund continued, his voice growing quieter, "she has requested that your daughters be brought to the capital for evaluation, to determine whether they possess any supernatural traits that might make them valuable assets in future negotiations." The temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees as Darius's carefully controlled composure finally cracked. The air around him shimmered with barely contained power, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of centuries. "Duchess Cordelia oversteps her bounds," he said, each word precise and deadly. "The protection of Princess Evelyn and her children falls under my jurisdiction now. Any attempt to remove them from my care will be considered an act of war against the Nightfall clan." Sir Edmund paled visibly at the threat, but pressed on with his duty. "My lord, the Duchess claims legal precedent, ancient laws governing the rights of nobility in matters of succession and marriage contracts." "Ancient laws?" Evelyn repeated slowly, her mind racing through possibilities. An idea was forming, dangerous and unprecedented, but potentially their only hope. "Sir Edmund, when is this petition to be heard by the High Council?" 3 days hence, Your Highness. You are summoned to appear and defend your position." Evelyn looked at Darius, seeing her own determination reflected in his storm-grey eyes. "Then we shall appear, but not as supplicants begging for mercy, as equals asserting our rights under laws even more ancient than those the Duchess would invoke." That night, as snow continued to fall outside the windows of her chambers, Evelyn found herself facing the most difficult conversation of her life. Her daughters sat arranged around her, Helena and Sophia on the window seat, the three younger girls curled up on the thick rug before the fireplace. "There's something important I need to tell you all," she began, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "About our family, about who we really are, and about the choices we're going to have to make." She told them everything, about the covenant, about their ancestral gifts, about the marks they carried and what they meant. She explained about Duchess Cordelia's challenge and what it could mean for their future if they lost. When she finished, the room was quiet except for the crackling of logs in the fireplace. It was Iris, predictably, who broke the silence. "So, we're magic?" the 4-year-old asked, with the matter-of-fact acceptance that only children could manage. "In a way, yes," Evelyn replied, smoothing her youngest daughter's golden hair. "But it's not the kind of magic that turns people into toads or makes flowers bloom in winter. It's the magic of bringing peace, of healing old wounds, of building bridges between different worlds. Like how you make Darius smile when he hears your songs," Helena asked perceptively. "Exactly like that." Sophia, ever practical, got straight to the heart of the matter. "What happens if we go to the capital and they decide we don't belong with you anymore?" It was the question Evelyn had been dreading, but also the one she was most prepared to answer. "Then we fight," she said simply. "Not with swords or soldiers, but with truth. We show them what real strength looks like. The strength that comes from love, from courage, from refusing to let anyone tell us we're worth less than we know ourselves to be." The next 3 days passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Darius called in favors from allies across multiple kingdoms, gathering testimonies about Evelyn's character and accomplishments. Ancient texts were studied, legal precedents researched, strategies planned and discarded and planned again. But it was Helena who provided the insight that changed everything. "Mama," she said on the morning they were to depart for the capital, holding up the book of vampire songs Darius had given her months ago. "Look at this notation I found in the margin. It's not about music at all. It's a legal formula." Evelyn examined the tiny script, her heart beginning to race as she realized what her daughter had discovered. Written in faded ink, barely visible unless one knew what to look for, was a clause that had been hidden in plain sight for generations. "The right of recognition," she breathed. "A ceremony that allows the Guardian of the Dawn to claim her full authority without requiring approval from any earthly court." Darius appeared in the doorway, as if summoned by her words, his expression hopeful for the first time in days. "You found it." "Helena found it," Evelyn corrected, pulling her eldest daughter into a fierce hug. "Our brilliant, observant Helena, who sees patterns where others see only decoration." The journey to the capital took 2 days through snow-covered roads that sparkled like diamonds under the winter sun. They traveled with a small but impressive entourage. Evelyn and her daughters in the royal carriage, Darius and his vampire companions on horseback, and a carefully selected group of witnesses who had volunteered to testify on their behalf. The High Council met in the ancient Amphitheatre of Justice, a circular stone building that had stood since the kingdom's founding. When they arrived, Evelyn was struck by how many people had gathered to witness the proceedings. Word of the unusual case had spread, drawing nobles and commoners alike, who were curious to see how the conflict would be resolved. Duchess Cordelia sat in the petitioners section, resplendent in emerald silk and dripping with jewelry that spoke of wealth and influence. Beside her sat several other nobles who had apparently allied themselves with her cause, their faces wearing expressions of smug certainty. The hearing began with formal presentations from both sides. The Duchess spoke eloquently about tradition, about the importance of maintaining established customs, about the dangers of allowing emotional decisions to override legal precedent. Princess Evelyn may be a woman of many virtues, she concluded, her voice carrying clearly through the amphitheater. But the simple fact remains that she has failed in her primary duty as a royal daughter, to provide male heirs who can ensure the continuity of our realm's alliances. To allow such a failure to be rewarded with an advantageous marriage to the most powerful vampire lord in 3 kingdoms sets a dangerous precedent that could destabilize our entire social order. When it was Evelyn's turn to speak, she rose slowly, her daughters arranged behind her like living testimony to her worth. She wore a gown of deep blue wool, simple and elegant, with the red thread embroidery that had taken on new meaning since her discovery of the Covenant. "Honored counselors," she began, her voice carrying the authority she had learned from years of addressing crowds of common folk who looked to her for leadership during times of crisis. "I stand before you today not as a supplicant begging for your approval, but as the rightful guardian of the dawn, claiming my place under laws that predate this kingdom by centuries." A murmur ran through the assembled crowd as she produced the ancient diary and began to read from its pages, explaining the covenant that had protected their realm for generations. She spoke of the vampire attacks that had never come, the diseases that had mysteriously bypassed their population, the harvests that had remained miraculously fertile even during the worst droughts. "This protection has not been free," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "It has been maintained by women of my bloodline who understood that true leadership means service, not dominance, who knew that real strength lies not in the ability to conquer, but in the wisdom to unite." She gestured to her daughters, and as if they had rehearsed it, each girl pushed back her sleeve to reveal the crescent marks that had begun to glow with a soft, pearl-like luminescence. "These are the signs of the covenant," Evelyn declared. "Not curses or defects, but gifts that enable my daughters to bring peace where there has been conflict, healing where there has been pain, hope where there has been despair." The amphitheater erupted in amazed whispers as people craned their necks to see the gentle light emanating from the girl's skin, but Evelyn wasn't finished. "Duchess Cordelia speaks of the importance of male heirs," she said, turning to face her challenger directly. "But I ask you, what is the greater strength? The power to force others to submit, or the ability to inspire them to choose cooperation? What serves a kingdom better? Rulers who demand obedience through fear, or leaders who earn loyalty through love?" She reached into her travel bag and withdrew the Journal of Songs, opening it to the page Helena had discovered. "The ancient laws recognize a ceremony that supersedes all earthly authority, the right of recognition by which a guardian of the dawn may claim her full power with the blessing of both realms." Darius rose from his seat in the gallery, his dark cloak billowing behind him as he moved to stand beside her. "The Nightfall clan formally requests the council's permission to perform this rite," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. "Not as a political maneuver, but as the fulfillment of a promise made by our ancestors to protect and honor the guardian bloodline." What followed was unlike anything the ancient amphitheater had ever witnessed. The rite of recognition was part ceremony, part trial, part celebration, a complex ritual that required participants from both realms to demonstrate their commitment to peace and mutual respect. Bread and salt were shared not just between Evelyn and Darius, but distributed throughout the assembled crowd, symbolizing the inclusion of all people in the Covenant's protection. Helena's voice rose in an ancient song that seemed to make the very stones of the amphitheater resonate with harmonious sound, while her sisters moved through the crowd, their gentle touches calming fears and easing tensions that had built up over years of mistrust between the realms. The climax came when dawn broke over the capital, And Evelyn, following the instructions written in her ancestral grandmother's careful script, spoke the words that had not been heard for over a century. By the light of dawn and the blessing of darkness, by the strength of love and the wisdom of mercy, I claim my place as guardian of the Aurora. Let the covenant be renewed, let the ancient promises be honored, and let all who would harm the innocent know that they face not just one woman, but the combined power of two realms united in purpose. As the first rays of true sunlight touched the amphitheater, something extraordinary happened. The light seemed to linger, growing stronger and more golden than it should have been at that hour, extending the precious moments of dawn that allowed vampires to move safely in the world above ground. Darius, who should have been seeking shelter from the strengthening sun, stood tall and unaffected in the extended twilight, his hand clasped firmly in Evelyn's as they faced the assembled council together. The vote, when it finally came, was unanimous. Not because of fear or political pressure, but because everyone present had witnessed something that transcended ordinary politics. A demonstration of power used not for conquest, but for protection, not for personal gain, but for the benefit of all. Duchess Cordelia's petition was formally dismissed, and the betrothal between Princess Evelyn and Lord Darius Blackthorne was officially sanctioned under the ancient laws that governed both realms. But more than that, Evelyn's daughters were formally recognized as guardians in training, their unique gifts acknowledged and protected by law. Never again would anyone dare to suggest that bearing daughters was a failure, or that feminine strength was somehow lesser than masculine power. As they stood together in the golden light of the extended dawn, surrounded by cheering crowds and the gentle glow of her daughter's crescent marks, Evelyn felt a peace she had never experienced before. The mockery that had cut so deep at the harvest ceremony seemed like something from another lifetime, a painful memory that had been transformed into the catalyst for something beautiful and lasting. "So," Darius murmured in her ear as the crowd began to disperse, "how does it feel to be the most powerful woman in 3 kingdoms?" Evelyn smiled, watching as Helena taught a group of vampire children a new song, as Sophia showed mortal nobles how to weave healing herbs into protective charms, as Iris distributed her latest drawings to anyone who looked like they needed cheering up. "It feels like coming home," she replied, meaning every word. "Like finally understanding what I was meant to be." The future stretched ahead of them, full of challenges and possibilities in equal measure. There would be more battles to fight, more bridges to build, more hearts and minds to change. But they would face it all together, not as vampire and mortal, not as day and night, but as partners in the truest sense of the word. The Guardian of the Dawn had claimed her throne at last, and the realms would never be the same.